My story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, is the most reprinted of any story of mine. So I've asked questions about it like every day in my life. I get questions about that story. So it is very interesting genesis to me because the first title of the story was Death and the Maiden. And that seems to signal a kind of fairy tale. Like death in the old medieval woodcuts, death is imagined as this figure with like a skull, and he may have a scythe in his hand. And he's standing behind a pretty girl with her hair is kind of loose, and she's primping in front of a mirror. And death is standing back here, and you see death in the mirror. She doesn't see death because we see death in the mirror. She sees herself, but we see death in the mirror. So if you look upon the story that I have written, you see that the fairy tale elements are always there, but they're sort of submerged. Death comes riding in on his horse. The girl is walking in the woods. She's a young girl, but she's all alone in the woods, and she should not be alone in the woods. So it's a cautionary tale. Death comes riding in on his horse. Sometimes he's a knight. He's got armor. His face is hidden. But he's death. And he asks her to climb up on his horse, and he doesn't grab her and put her on the horse. He asks her if she wants to come and ride with him. So she is the one who goes on the horse. It's very important that the maiden is volitional. She goes on the horse with this man, she doesn't know, a stranger, and they ride off. And she rides off to her death. And so my story is a replica of that sort of fairy tale situation. The story is based also upon something that really happened. So most writing has a number of influences. Something really happened in the Southwest. I read about it in Life magazine, and there was a two-page photographic spread of these terrible killings, the Pied Piper of Tucson, Arizona. And there was a man who was about 30. He pretended to be a teenager. He dyed his hair. He was quite short, and he wore cowboy boots with newspapers stuck in the boots so he would look taller. And he dressed like a teenager, and he tried to pretend to be a teenager. He hung out around shopping malls, and he befriended these girls who would become strolling along. And one by one, he was murdering girls. But what interested me about the story was this appalling and terrifying fact that some of the teenagers knew that he was murdering girls, and they didn't tell anybody. So they would go home to their parents, and they didn't tell. They protected him. Like, I thought, why would they protect this horrible person who, he's like Charles Manson, maybe that type of charismatic man preying upon adolescents, teenagers. So he seduced them in some way, but then even as he was murdering them, they defended him. Finally, it all came out, and he was arrested. But I didn't want to read any more about it, so I just read like 2 pages, and then I thought, well, I don't want to know any more about it. So I didn't look up I didn't do any research. So when I wrote the story, I thought I would be writing about the phenomenon of teenagers protecting a murderer. But when I actually wrote the story, I got much more interested in the victim, who's Connie. So as I wrote the story and thought about it, all my sympathy shifted to her. So then her name was Connie as the first line. So I'm just focusing on her. Then the murderer comes in a couple pages later, and he doesn't necessarily have a name right away. So rather than start with the murder and with the phenomenon of the teenagers protecting him, I started with the victim, and so the whole focus is different. But the story wasn't written immediately with Connie as the protagonist. It's a good example of how a story develops. So Connie is only 15 and she's very superficial and she's sort of a typical teenage girl, high school girl in the beginning of the story. But then as the story develops and death comes for her and she has this experience of terror, she becomes much more mature. And at the end of the story, she gets up and she goes out through the screen door of her own volition. It's as if she's deciding that she's going to be courageous and she's not any longer this superficial teenage girl, but she's somebody much more dignified by the end of the story. And of course she has two personalities. She has one personality with her mother and a different personality when she's with the teenagers. Like she's flirtatious and funny and sarcastic when she's with her friends. And then when she's with her mother, she's kind of sulky and resentful. She has a lot of secrets from her mother. But with her friends, she's this very pretty girl, and the older boys are interested in her. But with her mother, she's sort of pretending. So it's kind of this double personality that teenagers have. Teenage girls have, I assume teenage boys have also. The story is actually about a girl who realizes that her superficial self is not her real self. As death approaches her, it's almost like the other story that I was reading. Death is coming for her. She realizes that at the end, and she becomes very dignified. I wanted to show the layers that we have in our personalities, that we may seem superficial and trivial and very distracted by a lot of trivial things in our lives. But if we were going to die tomorrow, we'd forget all about this trivial stuff, and we would just focus on very important things. Like she thinks about her family, and she sort of thinks about her family in a way that she hadn't before. So the story ends with the predator who calls himself Arnold Friend. That's obviously not his name, but that's what he calls himself. And he's standing outside the door, the screen door, and Connie's in the house. And again, as in the parable or the fairy tale or the ballad of Death and the Maiden, she has to act volitionally. He's not going to come and get her. She makes her own judgment. After a while, she could hear again. She was sitting on the floor with her wet back against the wall. Arnold Friend was saying from the door, "That's a good girl, put the phone back." She kicked the phone away from her. "No, honey, pick it up and put it back right." She picked it up and put it back. The dial tone stopped. "That's a good girl. Now you come outside." She was hollow with what had been fear, but was now just an emptiness. All that screaming had blasted out of her. She sat, one leg cramped under her, and deep inside her brain was something like a pinpoint of light that kept going and would not let her relax. She thought, "I'm not going to see my mother again." She thought, "I'm not going to sleep in my bed again." Her bright green blouse was all wet. Arnold Friend said, in a gentle, loud voice that was like a stage voice, "That place where you came from ain't there anymore, and where you had mind to go is canceled out. This place you see now inside your daddy's house is nothing but a cardboard box I can knock down any time. You know that and always did know it. You hear me?" She thought, I've got to think. I've got to think. I've got to know what to do. "We'll go out to a nice field out in the country where it smells so nice and it's sunny," Arnold Friend said. "I'll have my arms tight around you so you won't need to try to get away, and I'll show you what love is like, what it does." "The hell with this house. It looks solid all right," he said. He ran a fingernail down the screen, and noise did not make Connie shiver as it would have the day before. "Now put your hand on your heart, honey. Feel that? That feels solid, too. But we know better. Be nice to me. Be sweet like you can be, because what else is there for a girl like you but to be sweet and pretty and give in and get away before her people come back?" She felt her pounding heart. Her hand seemed to enclose it. She thought for the first time in her life it was nothing that was hers, that belonged to her, but just a pounding, living thing inside the body that wasn't really hers either. "You don't want them to get hurt," Arnold Friend went on, meaning her family. "Come on, honey. Get up all by yourself. She stood. Now turn this way. That's right. Come over here. Come to me. The incantation was kindly. Now come out through the kitchen to me, honey, and let's see a smile. Trot, you're a brave, sweet girl. And now they're eating corn and hot dogs, cooked to bursting over an outdoor fire. That's Connie's family who was at a picnic. And they don't know one thing about you, and they never did. And honey, you're better than them, because not a one of them would have done this for you. In other words, Connie is sacrificing herself. She's going out to meet the predator before her family comes home. The implication is she's going to murder all of them unless she comes out, which she does. Connie felt the linoleum under her feet. It was cool. She brushed her hair back out of her eyes. Our little friend let go of the post tentatively and opened his arms for her, his elbows pointing in toward each other and his wrists limped, to show that this was an embarrassed embrace and a little mocking. He didn't want to make her self-conscious. She put out her hand against the screen. She watched herself push the door slowly open as if she were back safe somewhere in the other doorway, watching this body and this head of long hair moving out into the sunlight, where our friend waited. My sweet little blue-eyed girl, he said in a half-sung sigh that had nothing to do with her brown eyes, but was taken up just the same by the vast sunlit reaches of the land behind him and on all sides of him. So much land that Connie had never seen before and did not recognize except to know that she was going to it. Sometimes when you write a short story, you may overwrite, and there's a little more prose than you need. And when you read it through kind of quickly, you see that really it ended. It ended a little sooner. Like this story could have gone on for another paragraph or two, but when I reread it, I saw that it really ends when she makes her decision to go outside. And she understands that the body she's been inhabiting is finite, and she doesn't really own her body. And he says the house is like cardboard. In other words, our lives are very, very finite and very mortal. And she leaves the house of protection of her family, and she's going to leave her body, and she's going to go out into that vast sunlit space. It's like she's going back to nature. So that's like the ending of the story. We don't really have to know what happens next. So I felt that a person who is able to acknowledge death and embrace death and move into death was, no matter what age that person is, that there's a real maturity. And so I felt that she transcended her adolescent self. One assignment that I definitely suggest and advise for you as a experimental writer, take some writing that you've done, actually, something that you've been working on, that you have some hope and some investment in, and look at it from a different perspective. Let's say it may be in a third person and it's a little bit slow and you don't know what's wrong with it, to recast it as first person. So you're telling the story yourself. Another thing you could do is, if it's set in the past, radically update it and make it in present tense. In other words, instead of saying, once upon a time there was this girl, you say, she is walking, she is on her cell phone, she is doing something, and make it historic present. If you can do that, it makes it very lively and sort of breathless. It can completely revitalize some prose. Those are experiments. As with a house, you can walk around the house. The front door, you can go in through the front door. Now, you always thought you could go through the front door, but then one day, because I told you to, you walk around to the back and you look through a window and you just see a completely different scene, and suddenly the back window is a more interesting perspective. I had an experience just the other day with a young woman writing a really, really interesting beginning of a novel from the perspective of a 9-year-old girl, and there was a teacher, a fourth grade teacher, a tall black woman with long dreadlocks, and And it was so obvious to me that the real protagonist in this novel is that teacher. So I said to my student, I said, you know, the excitement of this chapter is in that teacher. And she looked at me and she sort of understood, of course, because the teacher is her age. And the little girl is sort of like just a child, and she can't really make the little girl be interesting because she's only 9. But the teacher who has to deal with all these children in a multiracial classroom, that's where the drama takes place. So I would think the next time she brings her work in, it's going to be this adult perspective and much more interesting. So that's something to do where you take a different perspective.